This video is about the MakerPlot macros menu. Let's click on it now. And we see a variety of choices here, which we'll get into in a second. I should say, though, that the macro menu is somewhat premature for explanation at this point, since we're just using a no-frills plot, but we'll mention some of its functions anyway in preparation for your learning more about it in future videos. First, macros are text-based instructions that configure the interface for things like meters, switches, LEDs, checkboxes, and so forth. There's none of these on the no-frills plot, but we'll see a few of them almost immediately here. Also, we should mention too that every macro file has a .spm extension, and that's how you're able to tell macros from other files. So let's take a look at one now. Here's the first choice, which is run macro. And if we come into here, we have two choices. We have a choice of the startup macro, and we have a choice of a folder called interfaces. If we choose startup, and if you look carefully, it has the SPM file extension to it. Double click on it, and we come up with the startup menu for the MakerPlot program. This is normally what you will see when you load the program from the desktop icon. So going back to the macro menus, it asks us now to select the startup macro. And again, we have it set to startup.spm, but we can change it. So let's do that, just for example. So startup is one we had. Let's go to the interfaces. We have 10 different macros that you see in the startup macro visually here. So let's choose one of them as to be our new startup macro. Let's choose the one that says alarming meters, and we'll say yes, start new macro, start new plot using this macro. Click yes. And now up comes our alarming meters macro. By going back to our macro screen, we notice now that our select startup macro is now interfaces/mp alarming meters.spm. So that's our new startup macro. We can change this at any time, but we're going to leave it at this level at the moment because we want to show you a few other features. Now the next box here is run startup macro on load, and you'll notice that it's checked. Now you can click on it and uncheck it, but we normally like to have it checked because we want to run our startup macro every time we click on the MakerPlot icon on the desktop. So leave this checked, and when it's checked, this particular macro, in this case MP alarming meters, will be run every time we load the program. And then run startup macro is just what it says, and that is if we forgot what the macro is, we can just click on this, and we're going to reload our MP alarming meters macro once again. Now, if we've forgotten what that startup macro was, the thing with the one with all the various choices, we can come down here to the selection called Run Installed Interface Select Macro. So click on it, and there we have it. There's our startup macro again. We will always be able to remember where this macro is simply by clicking on this. It always comes back to this particular screen. One of the things we can do with macros is edit them. And we can do it in two ways. We can do it with a thing built into MakerPlot called a macro builder, or we can edit it with Notepad. Let's just take a view of what it is with the macro builder. Here's our macro builder pull down from our toolbar menu. There's a lot to this which we'll get into in another video series, but nevertheless, here you can see in this window are our initialized macro instructions. Here's some object instructions, user-defined instructions, which there are none in this case, and so forth. So that's one way of editing macros. Another way of editing macros is with Notepad. So we just click on this, click on the macro that we would like to edit, and let's just choose Startup. And here is a Notepad listing of the Startup macro. And once again, we can come in here, examine it, edit it, save it, and actually physically change the interface macro that you see on your screen now to something different that you may want to customize for yourself. So here, these are the two basic ways of editing macros with the macro menu. Two other selections say use analog data for macro only. If this is checked, which I just did now, that means the analog data will not be plotted, but rather will go directly into your macro files where you may choose to have it plotted or not. So this is a choice. Normally this is left unchecked, so let's uncheck it. Another one that's normally left unchecked is use messages for macro only. Once again, if MakerPlot generates an error message or a user message in terms of an alarm or some other feature like that, if this particular box is checked, then that particular message and all messages for that matter will go into the macro file that will then decide whether or not you, the user, should see it. So again, let's leave this unchecked. So that's a brief rundown, and very brief rundown, of the macros menu selection. And again, we'll learn much more about the macros in another video series.